Hi, I'm Emma. My grandmother Katherine once told me that family loyalty runs deeper than blood, but when she passed away last month, leaving behind a $5 million estate, my relatives excluded me from the will reading and claimed I had no legal right to anything. What they didn't know was that Grandma Katherine had spent her final years secretly documenting every family lie and preparing the ultimate surprise. 3 days later, when that lawyer called the family back together and said, "The real heir just arrived," the looks on their faces were worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Claire Morrison, and I'm 26 years old, living in a studio apartment in downtown Portland, Oregon, working as a social worker for the county's Child Protective Services. Growing up, people always said I had my grandmother's eyes, the same deep green that seemed to see straight through pretense and into people's souls. Katherine Elizabeth Whitmore was the kind of woman who commanded respect without raising her voice, who built a real estate empire from a single rental property she bought with her waitressing tips in 19. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 15 acres in the hills of Lake Oswego, complete with a main house that looked like something from a Southern Gothic novel, gardens that required a full-time groundskeeper, and enough antiques to stock a museum. But more than the material wealth, Grandma Katherine possessed something far more valuable, an unwavering moral compass that guided every decision she made. She was the kind of person who remembered the birthdays of every grocery store clerk she'd known for more than a month, who quietly paid medical bills for families she barely knew, and who never let a slight go unaddressed, though her justice was always served cold and calculated. I spent every summer at the Whitmore house from the time I could walk until I graduated college, while my cousins Brittany and Madison preferred to stay in their air-conditioned bedrooms scrolling through social media. I followed Grandma Katherine around like a devoted puppy. She taught me how to identify quality antiques, how to read property deeds, and most importantly, how to spot a liar from 3 rooms away. "Emma," she'd say while we pruned her prize-winning roses, "people reveal their true nature when they think nobody important is watching. Always be watching." The Whitmore family dynamics were complicated in the way that only wealthy families can manage. My father, David, was Katherine's youngest son, but he died in a car accident when I was 8. My mother, Lisa, remarried within 2 years to a man named Robert Chen, who had no interest in maintaining connections with his stepdaughter's deceased father's family. Lisa gradually distanced herself from the Whitmores, claiming they made her feel inadequate, which left me caught between 2 worlds: the modest suburban life with my mother and stepfather, and the elegant complexity of the Whitmore legacy. Katherine's other children included my uncle Richard, a successful surgeon who lived in Seattle with his wife Patricia and their twin daughters Brittany and Madison, and my Aunt Caroline, who'd married into old money and spent most of her time in Europe managing her husband's art gallery. Both Richard and Caroline visited Katherine regularly, but their conversations always seemed to center around investment portfolios, property values, and estate planning. I was the only one who actually listened when she told stories about her childhood during the Depression, who helped her organize her extensive photo collections, and who genuinely enjoyed her company without constantly calculating what it might be worth someday. The last time I saw Grandma Katherine alive was on a crisp Sunday in September. I'd driven down from Portland to help her sort through some old documents in her study, a mahogany-paneled room filled with leather-bound books and filing cabinets that contained decades of business records. She seemed more fragile than usual, but her mind was sharp as ever. We spent the afternoon organizing paperwork, and she kept making cryptic comments about making sure everything was properly documented, and that truth has a way of surfacing when it matters most. That afternoon, she handed me an ornate brass key attached to a velvet ribbon. "This opens my personal safe," she said, pressing it into my palm. "Promise me something, Emma. If anything happens to me, and if anyone ever tries to tell you that you don't belong in this family, you use this key. There are things in that safe that will remind you exactly who you are and where you come from." I promised. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Though I didn't understand why she looked so serious, why her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, I thought she was just being overly cautious. the way elderly people sometimes become when they start thinking about mortality. I slipped the key into my wallet and forgot about it until 3 weeks later when Uncle Richard called with the news that would change everything. Katherine had died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday night in October. The housekeeper, Maria, found her the next morning, still wearing her reading glasses with a book about genealogy open on her chest. The funeral was held on Friday at the Presbyterian church she'd attended for 40 years, and it was packed with people whose lives she'd touched in ways both public and private. Local business leaders, former employees, neighbors, and dozens of families she'd helped financially over the years, all came to pay their respects to a woman who'd made generosity an art form. But even at the funeral, I sensed something was off. Uncle Richard and Aunt Caroline kept having whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I approached. Brittany and Madison, usually glued to their phones, were unusually attentive to every adult conversation. When people asked about Katherine's legacy and what would happen to the estate, my relatives gave vague answers about honoring her wishes and keeping everything in the family. They spoke about Katherine's generosity and wisdom, but something in their tone felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced these responses. The strange behavior continued at the post-funeral reception back at the house. I helped Maria serve refreshments while my relatives entertained guests, but I noticed they were all wearing expensive new jewelry and designer clothes I'd never seen before. Aunt Caroline's diamond bracelet looked like it cost more than my annual salary, and Uncle Richard kept checking an obviously new Rolex. When I mentioned to Brittany that her grandmother would have loved seeing so many people come to honor her memory, she gave me a pitying look and said, "Emma, you know Grandma always worried about your financial situation. At least now you won't have to feel guilty about not being able to help her anymore." The comment struck me as odd, because I'd never felt guilty about my financial situation, and Katherine had never expressed any concern about it. If anything, she'd always seemed proud of my choice to work in social services, often saying that helping vulnerable children was more valuable than any amount of money. But Brittany's tone suggested she knew something I didn't, and that knowledge made her feel superior in a way that made my stomach churn. 2 days after the funeral, Uncle Richard called me at work. His voice had a formal quality I'd never heard before, like he was reading from a script. "Emma, I wanted to let you know that we've scheduled the will reading for this Thursday at 2 o'clock. It'll be at Mom's attorney's office downtown." "Should I take the afternoon off work?" I asked, already mentally rearranging my schedule. There was a pause. "Actually, Emma, the attorney says it's really just for immediate family members who are specifically named in the will. You know how these legal things work. They have to keep it limited to people who have a direct stake in the proceedings. But I am immediate family. I'm her granddaughter." "Of course you are, sweetheart." I just meant, well, the will is pretty straightforward. It's mostly business assets and property transfers between Caroline and me. Nothing that would really concern you. The words hit me like cold water. Nothing that would concern me. As if 26 years of being Katherine's granddaughter could be dismissed with a casual sentence. "Are you saying I'm not mentioned in the will at all?" "I'm not saying anything definitive. I just don't want you to take time off work unnecessarily. If there's anything that involves you, we'll certainly let you know." After I hung up, I sat in my small office overlooking the parking lot of the county building where I worked, trying to process what had just happened. Every logical part of my brain insisted this had to be a misunderstanding. Katherine and I had been close in a way that transcended typical grandmother-grandchild relationships. She'd been my mentor, my confidant, and in many ways, the most important person in my life after my father died. The idea that she would have excluded me entirely from her will seemed impossible, but doubt began creeping in, as I remembered all those whispered conversations at the funeral. All those meaningful glances between my relatives. Maybe they knew something I did. Maybe Katherine's affection for me had been more sentimental than practical, and when it came to actual inheritance, she'd focused on her children, who could handle significant financial responsibility. Maybe I'd misunderstood the depth of our relationship, projecting more meaning onto her kindness than actually existed. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and drizzling, typical for October in Portland. I tried to focus on my caseload, but every few minutes I found myself checking the clock and wondering what was happening in that lawyer's office. At exactly 2:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Brittany. "Will reading went smoothly. Grandma provided well for the family. Hope you're having a good day at work." The casual tone of the message felt like a slap. Provided well for the family. Apparently a family that didn't include me. I stared at the text for several minutes, waiting for additional information that never came. No details about Katherine's wishes, no mention of anything left for me. Not even an expression of sympathy that I'd been excluded from this important family moment. That evening I drove to my mother's house in Beaverton, needing to talk to someone who'd known Katherine and could help me make sense of what had happened. Lisa was in the kitchen making dinner when I arrived, and she took one look at my face and poured 2 glasses of wine without asking why I needed to talk. "Mom, did you know Grandma Katherine was planning to leave me out of her will?" Lisa paused with her wine glass halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" "The family had the will reading today. I wasn't invited. Uncle Richard said it was just for immediate family members who are specifically mentioned." "Oh, honey." Lisa set down her glass and reached across the kitchen island to squeeze my hand. "I'm sure there's an explanation. Maybe she set up a separate trust for you, or maybe she left you personal items instead of financial assets. You know how complicated these wealthy family estates can be. But why wouldn't they tell me that? Why make me feel like I don't exist?" Lisa sighed, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "Emma, I think you might have put Katherine on a pedestal. She was a generous woman, but she was also very practical about money. She probably figured that you're young and capable of building your own life, while Richard and Caroline have families and business obligations that require more immediate support. So you think it's reasonable that I got nothing? I think it's reasonable that you got her love and attention while she was alive, which is worth more than any inheritance." But even as Lisa spoke these comforting words, I could see uncertainty in her eyes. She'd always been slightly intimidated by the Whitmore family's wealth and status, but she'd also witnessed the genuine bond between Katherine and me. Something about this situation didn't feel right to her either, even if she was trying to help me accept it gracefully. That night I lay awake in my studio apartment, staring at the ceiling and replaying every conversation I'd had with Katherine over the past few months. Had there been clues I'd missed? Had she been trying to prepare me for disappointment without hurting my feelings? Or had she simply assumed that her affection for me was obvious to everyone, including whoever drafted her will? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Katherine had always been meticulous about planning and documentation. She'd spent decades building her business empire through careful attention to legal details and strategic thinking. It seemed completely out of character for her to handle something as important as her will carelessly or without considering all the people who mattered to her. Friday morning brought another text, this time from Aunt Caroline. "Emma, dear, we wanted you to know that we're planning to sell the house and most of Katherine's belongings. If there are any small personal items you'd like as keepsakes, please let us know by next week. We're donating everything else to charity." Small personal items, keepsakes. The language was so dismissive it made my chest tight with anger. Katherine's antique jewelry collection alone was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and her library contained first-edition books that museums would fight over. But I was being offered the equivalent of garage sale leftovers, as if my relationship with her had been worth exactly that much consideration. I spent the weekend in a strange emotional limbo, oscillating between hurt and confusion. Part of me wanted to call Uncle Richard and demand a detailed explanation. Part of me wanted to show up at the house and insist on seeing the will myself. But another part of me was terrified that doing either of those things would confirm what my relatives had already implied, that I was grasping and inappropriate, trying to claim something that had never been mine to begin with. Sunday evening, while cleaning out my wallet to organize receipts for my monthly budget, I found the brass key Katherine had given me. The velvet ribbon had faded from deep purple to dusty lavender, and the metal had developed a slight patina that made it look older than its 3 weeks. Suddenly Katherine's words came flooding back. "If anyone ever tries to tell you that you don't belong in this family, you use this key." She'd known, somehow she'd anticipated exactly what would happen, and she'd given me the means to discover the truth. But what truth? What could be in her personal safe that would explain why her family was treating me like an outsider? Monday morning I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. Instead of sitting in my office reviewing case files, I drove to Lake Oswego and parked across the street from the Whitmore house. For nearly an hour I sat there watching the familiar windows and wondering if I had the courage to use the key Katherine had entrusted to me. The logical part of my brain warned that I might be violating some legal boundary, that opening Katherine's safe without permission from her estate executors could get me in serious trouble. But the stronger part of me, the part that had inherited Katherine's sense of justice and refusal to accept unfairness, knew that she'd given me that key for exactly this moment. She'd anticipated that her family would try to erase me from her legacy, and she'd provided me with the tools to fight back. The key fit perfectly into the lock of Katherine's personal safe, which was hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom closet. Inside I found documents that made my hands tremble as I read them, a second will dated just 2 months before her death, several sealed envelopes marked with different family members' names, and a thick folder labeled Emma's Heritage, the complete truth. The second will was completely different from whatever document had been read at Thursday's meeting. According to this version, Katherine left her entire estate to me, along with detailed explanations for why she'd made this choice. The sealed envelopes contained what appeared to be Katherine's final communications to her other relatives, explaining her decision and addressing the lies they'd apparently been telling about our family history. But it was the contents of Emma's Heritage folder that changed everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the Whitmore family. Inside were documents that revealed a secret Katherine had been keeping for over 25 years. A secret that explained not only why she'd left everything to me, but why my relatives had been so determined to exclude me from her legacy. The Heritage folder contained photocopies of birth certificates, adoption papers and DNA test results that painted a picture I'd never imagined. According to these documents, my father David wasn't Katherine's biological son at all. He'd been adopted when he was 6 years old, after his birth parents died in a house fire in 19. The shocking part was that Katherine had conducted a DNA test 18 months ago that proved something extraordinary. I carried genetic markers that matched Katherine's late husband William Whitmore but not through David's lineage. The explanation came in a handwritten letter from Katherine, dated just 3 weeks before her death. In her careful script, she'd written, "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means my other children have done exactly what I feared they would do. They've tried to erase you from our family legacy because they've never understood the truth about who you really are. Your father David was my adopted son, and I loved him as fiercely as any biological child. But you, my precious granddaughter, carry the blood of William Whitmore through a line we never knew existed." The letter went on to explain that Katherine's husband William had a brother named Thomas, who'd disappeared during World War II. The family had assumed Thomas died overseas, but apparently he'd survived and started a new life under an assumed name. Thomas Whitmore became Thomas Morrison, and he'd had a son named James Morrison, who'd grown up never knowing his true heritage. James Morrison had been my maternal grandfather, my mother Lisa's father, who died when she was young. This meant that while David Morrison, the man I'd called father, was Katherine's adopted son with no biological connection to the Whitmore family, I was actually related to Katherine through my mother's side. I was William Whitmore's great-niece, which made me Katherine's great-niece by marriage, but more importantly, I was the only person in our generation who carried the authentic Whitmore bloodline. Katherine's letter continued, "I discovered this truth when I began researching our family genealogy after William's death. The DNA testing confirmed what historical records suggested: you are the last direct descendant of the Whitmore line. Richard and Caroline have spent years assuming they would inherit everything because they're my biological children, but they've never understood that my greatest joy wasn't in building wealth for them. It was in discovering that our family line would continue through you, a young woman who embodies every value William and I held dear." The implications were staggering. Not only was I not the outsider my relatives had made me feel like, I was actually the most legitimate heir to the Whitmore legacy. Katherine had left me everything not out of sentimental favoritism, but because I was the rightful inheritor of a bloodline that stretched back 4 generations. She'd spent her final years quietly documenting this truth, preparing legal documents that would ensure her discovery wouldn't die with her. But there were more revelations in the folder. Katherine had also included copies of correspondence between her and a private investigator she'd hired to research the family history. The investigators' reports revealed that Uncle Richard and Aunt Caroline had been pressuring Katherine for years to update her will in their favor. They'd been particularly insistent after Katherine's heart attack 2 years ago, arguing that she needed to be realistic about the family's financial future and stop indulging Emma's unrealistic expectations. According to the investigators' notes, Richard had even consulted with an attorney about challenging any will that left significant assets to me, on the grounds that Katherine might be experiencing age-related cognitive decline. Caroline had been more subtle, gradually introducing ideas about how the estate should be managed professionally by people with appropriate business experience. Both siblings had been operating under the assumption that their biological connection to Katherine gave them automatic priority over an adopted son's daughter. The cruelest revelation was in a transcript of a conversation the investigator had recorded between Richard and Caroline at a family gathering 6 months ago. They'd been discussing their strategy for ensuring Katherine's will reflected their preferences, and Caroline had said, "The girl is sweet, but she's always been overly emotional about family connections. Mother feels guilty about David's death, so she overcompensates by making Emma feel special. We just need to help Mother understand that sentiment can't override practical considerations." Richard had responded, "Emma will be fine, she's young and she has a stable job. It's not like she's depending on an inheritance to survive. We have children who need college funds and business investments. Mother will see reason if we present it properly." They'd been manipulating Katherine, or at least attempting to, while simultaneously planning to marginalize me based on their assumption that I had no legitimate claim to the family legacy. They'd seen my close relationship with Katherine as a threat to their financial interests, never considering that there might be deeper reasons for our connection beyond mere sentiment. The most damning document in the folder was a copy of a letter Richard had sent to Katherine's original attorney, Dr. James Henley, expressing concerns about Emma's influence on Katherine's estate planning decisions. In the letter, Richard had suggested that Katherine might be vulnerable to manipulation due to her age and recent health issues, and that the family was worried about outside influences affecting her judgment regarding her will. Katherine had apparently received a copy of this letter because she'd written in the margins, "Richard assumes that Emma's love for me must be motivated by money, because that's how he measures his own relationships. He cannot conceive that someone might value our connection for its own sake." This letter confirms everything I suspected about my children's priorities. Armed with this knowledge, I understood why Katherine had been so secretive about her final wish. She'd known that Richard and Caroline would attempt to challenge any will that didn't meet their expectations, so she'd created an elaborate backup plan. The will they'd heard read on Thursday was apparently a decoy, an earlier version that Katherine had deliberately left accessible to satisfy their expectations. The real will, the one that reflected her true intentions, had been secured in this private safe along with all the documentation needed to prove its validity. But Katherine had gone even further to protect her real intentions. According to a note from her attorney, Dr. Henley, she'd established an irrevocable trust that would activate upon her death, with me as the sole beneficiary. The trust included not only her financial assets and real estate holdings, but also legal provisions that would prevent any challenges based on claims of undue influence or mental incapacity. Katherine had undergone comprehensive psychological evaluations to establish her mental competency, and she'd recorded video testimonies explaining her decisions that could be used in court if necessary. The final document in the folder was perhaps the most touching, a letter Katherine had written directly to me, explaining not just the legal and genealogical facts, but her emotional reasoning for her choices. "Emma," she'd written, "I have watched you grow into exactly the kind of person William and I hoped our legacy would produce. You chose a career dedicated to helping vulnerable children rather than pursuing wealth. You've shown compassion for people society often overlooks. You've demonstrated integrity in situations where others might have compromised their values for personal gain. You represent everything the Whitmore name should stand for." The letter continued, "Richard and Caroline are not bad people, but they've been shaped by privilege in ways that have made them lose sight of what truly matters. They see our family wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. They measure success in terms of acquisition rather than contribution. I don't blame them for this. I share responsibility for raising children who never learned to value character over comfort. But I cannot, in good conscience, leave our family's resources to people who would use them primarily for their own benefit. Katherine went on to explain her hopes for how I would use the inheritance. She wanted me to continue her tradition of quiet philanthropy, supporting causes that helped working families build better lives for their children. She'd particularly hoped I would expand the scholarship fund she'd established for first-generation college students from low-income families. She'd also expressed interest in my idea of creating a program that provided financial literacy education to women leaving abusive relationships. But beyond the specific charitable work, Katherine had wanted me to use the Whitmore resources to live a life free from financial stress, so I could continue choosing meaningful work over lucrative work. I've watched you struggle to pay your student loans while working in an underpaid but essential profession, she'd written. I want you to have the freedom to help people without worrying about your own financial security. That's what wealth should provide, the ability to contribute to the world without being constrained by economic necessity. Reading Katherine's words, I felt a complex mixture of validation and overwhelming responsibility. She'd not only left me her material wealth, but she'd entrusted me with carrying forward her values and vision for how that wealth should be used. The inheritance wasn't just money and property, it was a mandate to live up to her faith in my character and judgment. But even as I felt honored by Katherine's trust, I also felt terrified by the confrontation that would inevitably come. Richard and Caroline had clearly been operating under assumptions about their inheritance rights that were about to be shattered. They'd already shown themselves capable of manipulation and deception in their attempts to influence Katherine's decision. How would they react when they discovered that not only had their schemes failed, but that the person they'd dismissed as a sentimental favorite was actually the legitimate heir to everything they'd expected to inherit? The legal documents in the folder indicated that Dr. Deanley, Katherine's attorney, was scheduled to contact me within a week of her death to arrange a private meeting about the real will. That meeting was supposed to have happened 3 days ago, which meant either Dr. Henley was delayed for some reason, or my relatives had somehow interfered with his ability to reach me. Given what I'd learned about their willingness to manipulate situations to their advantage, I suspected the latter. I also realized that my relatives' quick planning for selling Katherine's house and belongings wasn't just about settling the estate efficiently. They were rushing to liquidate assets before anyone could question their right to do so. Once the house was sold and the contents dispersed, it would be much more difficult to prove that they'd acted without proper authority. They were essentially attempting to steal the inheritance by moving faster than any legal challenges could stop them. The situation was complicated by the fact that I had no idea how much the family lawyer Dr. Henley might know about Richard and Caroline's deception. It was possible that they'd told him I was unreachable or uninterested in the estate proceeding. It was also possible that they'd convinced him to delay contacting me while they handled the immediate estate matters. Either way, I needed to contact Dr. Henley immediately to ensure that Katherine's real wishes were honored. But first, I needed to process the emotional impact of everything I'd discovered. In the space of one morning, I'd learned that my entire understanding of my family relationships was wrong, that I was the rightful heir to a fortune I'd never expected to inherit, and that relatives I'd trusted had been actively working to exclude me from my own heritage.
The betrayal was deeper than I'd initially realized. They hadn't just excluded me from a will reading. They'd been plotting for months to ensure I wouldn't interfere with their plans to inherit wealth that legally belonged to me. The revelation about my true genealogical connection to the Whitmore family also reframed every interaction I'd had with Katherine over the years. Her special attention to me hadn't been favoritism or sentimentality. It had been recognition of a family bond that ran deeper than anyone else understood. She'd known that I carried the bloodline she and William had dedicated their lives to honoring, and she'd been preparing me to carry that legacy forward. Sitting in Katherine's bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of her careful planning and foresight, I felt a profound sense of connection to a woman who'd managed to protect her true heir, even after death. She'd anticipated every challenge I would face and provided me with the tools to overcome them. But she'd also placed enormous trust in my ability to handle the responsibility that came with the Whitmore inheritance. I spent the rest of the morning carefully photographing every document in the folder, creating digital backups that I could store securely. Katherine's planning had been meticulous, but I wanted to ensure that no single point of failure could prevent her wishes from being fulfilled. I also made copies of the most important documents to keep in my apartment, separate from the originals that needed to remain in the safe. By noon, I was ready to take the next step in what I now understood would be a complex battle for my inheritance rights. Katherine had given me the weapons I needed to fight for what was rightfully mine, but the war itself was just beginning. Richard and Caroline had spent months preparing their strategy based on false assumptions about their legal standing. Now I had to be equally strategic about revealing the truth in a way that would minimize their ability to create additional obstacles. The first call I needed to make was to Dr. Dilly to understand why he hadn't contacted me as Katherine's instructions had specified. The second call would be to my own attorney, because I suspected I was going to need independent legal representation to navigate the challenges ahead. Katherine had provided me with the truth, but translating that truth into legal reality would require careful planning and professional guidance. As I locked the safe and prepared to leave Katherine's house, I felt a strange mixture of grief and anticipation. I was mourning the loss of my grandmother and the simpler family relationships I'd thought I understood. But I was also anticipating the moment when I would walk into that attorney's office and watch my relatives realize that their carefully laid plans had been built on a foundation of lies and wishful thinking. Katherine had always taught me that justice was worth fighting for, even when the battle seemed impossible. Now I understood that she'd been preparing me for the most important fight of my life. The fight to claim my own identity and inheritance in the face of family members who'd tried to erase me from our shared history. The real heir had indeed arrived, and I was ready to prove exactly who that was. Dr. James Henley's law office occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Portland with tall windows that overlooked the Willamette River. When I called his office that Monday afternoon, his secretary informed me that he'd been trying to reach me for several days, but had been told by my family that I was traveling abroad and unreachable. The lie was so brazen it took my breath away. Richard and Caroline hadn't just excluded me from their fake will reading, they'd actively prevented Katherine's real attorney from fulfilling her final instructions. Dr. Henley agreed to see me immediately when I explained that I'd been in town all week and had never received any messages. His office was exactly what I'd expected from Katherine's longtime legal counsel. Leather-bound law books lined mahogany shelves, Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and diplomas from Harvard Law School hung beside photographs of Dr. Henley with various judges and politicians. He was a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of Katherine's penetrating gaze. "Miss Morrison," he said as I settled into the chair across from his massive desk, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was not only a valued client but a dear friend. She spoke of you constantly, always with tremendous pride and affection." He paused, studying my face carefully. "I assume you're here because you've discovered the contents of her private safe." I nodded, placing the folder of documents on his desk. "She left me a key and told me to use it if anyone tried to tell me I didn't belong in the family. I think I understand why now." Henley opened the folder and quickly reviewed the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. Katherine was incredibly thorough in her preparations. She anticipated exactly what would happen after her death, and she took extensive measures to protect your interests. "What troubles me is that your uncle specifically told me you were out of the country and couldn't be reached for several weeks. He suggested we proceed with settling the estate based on the preliminary will while waiting for your return." "The preliminary?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what he meant. Katherine created what she called a decoy will about a year ago, knowing that her other heirs would likely demand to see her estate plan. That document left modest bequests to you while dividing the majority of her assets between Richard and Caroline. She instructed me to allow them access to that version if they became too insistent about reviewing her testamentary wishes. Henley pulled out a thick legal document bound in blue backing. "This is Katherine's actual last will and testament, executed just 2 months before her death. As you've seen from her letters, it names you as the sole beneficiary of her entire estate, with the exception of small personal gifts to her household staff and charitable donations to organizations she supported." The weight of Katherine's decision hit me anew as Henley explained the scope of the inheritance. The estate included not only the Lake Oswego house and its contents, but also a diversified investment portfolio worth approximately $4 million, rental properties throughout the Portland metro area generating substantial monthly income, and business interests in several local companies Katherine had helped finance over the years. The total value exceeded $6 million, making it one of the larger estates Dr. Henley had handled in his 4 decades of practice. Katherine was very clear about her reasoning. Henley continued, pulling out a sealed video recording. She recorded this testimony 3 months ago, specifically to prevent any challenges based on claims of mental incapacity or undue influence. She also underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation to document her cognitive competency at the time she finalized her estate plans. We watched Katherine's video testimony together, and hearing her voice again brought tears to my eyes. She looked directly into the camera with the same steady confidence she'd shown throughout her life, explaining her genealogical discoveries and her reasons for choosing me as her heir. Her words were clear and measured, leaving no doubt about her mental acuity or the deliberate nature of her decision. I am leaving my entire estate to my great-niece Emma Morrison because she represents the continuation of the Whitmore family values that my late husband William and I worked our entire lives to uphold. Katherine said in the recording, Emma has demonstrated through her career choices and personal conduct that she understands wealth as a responsibility rather than an entitlement. She has shown compassion for vulnerable members of society and has consistently chosen service over self-interest. The video continued with Katherine addressing potential objections from her other heirs. I anticipate that Richard and Caroline will challenge this will on various grounds. They may claim that Emma exerted undue influence over my decisions, despite the fact that she was never aware of her inheritance until after my death. They may argue that I was not mentally competent, despite the professional evaluations that prove otherwise. Most likely they will assert that biological children should take precedence over other relatives, ignoring the fact that Emma's bloodline connection to William makes her the rightful heir to our family legacy. Katherine's foresight was remarkable. She'd anticipated every argument my relatives might make, and had prepared comprehensive responses supported by legal documentation and professional testimony. Henley had also arranged for backup witnesses who could testify about Katherine's mental state and decision-making process in the months before her death. Your grandmother was particularly concerned about preventing your relatives from liquidating estate assets before the true will could be probated, Dr. Henley explained. She instructed me to obtain immediate restraining orders against any attempts to sell property or dispose of valuable items without proper legal authority. This news sent a chill through me as I remembered Aunt Caroline's text about selling the house and donating Katherine's belongings. They're planning to start clearing out the house this week. Caroline asked me to let them know if I wanted any small keepsakes before they donate everything else. Dr. Henley's expression darkened. They have no legal authority to dispose of any estate asset. The preliminary will they heard read last week specifically states that all distributions are subject to final probate proceedings. Either they're ignorant of basic estate law, or they're deliberately attempting to prevent challenges by creating irreversible changes to the estate. We spent the next hour developing a strategy for asserting my inheritance rights, while protecting the estate from further manipulation. Henley would immediately file the real will for probate and obtain court orders preventing any disposition of estate assets until the proceedings were complete. He would also notify Richard and Caroline that their information about my availability had been incorrect, and that I was prepared to participate fully in all estate proceedings. I should warn you, Henley said as our meeting concluded, your relatives are likely to respond aggressively when they discover the true contents of Katherine's will. They've been operating under the assumption that they would inherit the majority of her wealth, and they may have already made financial commitments based on those expectations. People in such situations sometimes resort to desperate measures to protect what they believe is rightfully theirs. His warning proved prophetic. Within 2 hours of Dr. Henley's calls to Richard and Caroline, my phone began buzzing with increasingly frantic messages. The first was from Richard demanding that I call him immediately to discuss serious irregularities in the estate proceeding. The second was from Caroline, insisting that I was being manipulated by opportunistic attorneys who were trying to exploit family tensions for their own profit. But it was the third call from my cousin Brittany that revealed just how desperate my relatives had become. Emma, what the hell are you doing? She demanded before I could even say hello.
My dad says you're trying to steal Grandma's inheritance with some fake will. This is insane. You know Grandma would never have left you everything. She loved all of us equally. Did she? I asked quietly. Because your family didn't think I was worth including in the will reading last week. That was just a formality. We were going to tell you about your inheritance afterward. Dad says you probably forged those documents you showed the lawyer. He's talking about having you arrested for fraud. The accusation was so outrageous it almost made me laugh. Brittany, do you really think I'm capable of forging legal documents and fooling Katherine's attorney of 40 years? I think you've always been jealous of our family's success, and now you're seeing an opportunity to take what doesn't belong to you. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Brittany alternating between threats and attempts at emotional manipulation. She reminded me of family gatherings where I'd allegedly seemed resentful of their wealth, holiday gifts I'd supposedly rejected out of spite, and conversations where I'd apparently made comments about feeling excluded from family decisions. None of these accusations were accurate, but I realized they represented a narrative my relatives had been constructing to explain why I didn't deserve equal treatment. That evening, Uncle Richard called with a different approach. His voice was carefully controlled, the tone he probably used with difficult patients who needed to be managed rather than treated as equals. Emma, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Caroline and I never intended to exclude you from Katherine's legacy. We were simply trying to handle the legal formalities efficiently so we could focus on grieving as a family. If that's true, why did you tell Dr. Henley I was traveling abroad? I was told by someone at your workplace that you were taking emergency leave for a family situation. I assumed you'd gone to stay with your mother's relatives during this difficult time. The lie was smooth and plausible, the kind of explanation that might convince someone who hadn't seen the documentary evidence of their manipulation. Richard, I've been working every day since the funeral. My supervisor never told anyone I was taking leave. Well, there must have been some miscommunication. The important thing now is that we resolve this family dispute before it becomes a public scandal. Katherine would be horrified to see us fighting over money when we should be honoring her memory. Richard's strategy was clear: reframe the conflict as a family disagreement rather than a legal matter, appeal to my emotions rather than my rights, and pressure me to accept a compromise that would preserve their inheritance expectations, while giving me just enough to feel included. He suggested we meet as a family to discuss equitable distribution of Katherine's assets, taking into account everyone's needs, and Katherine's true intentions. What about taking into account Katherine's actual will? Emma, you have to understand that elderly people sometimes make impulsive decisions when they're facing mortality. Katherine may have been influenced by her guilt about David's death, or by her concern about your financial struggle. A will written so close to her death, leaving everything to one person, is exactly the kind of document that raises questions about mental competency and outside influence. Richard's words were carefully chosen to plant doubt about the validity of Katherine's final wishes, while positioning himself as the voice of reason, protecting both Katherine's reputation and family harmony. But his arguments revealed how little he understood about Katherine's character or her decision-making process. The woman who'd built a real estate empire through decades of careful planning and strategic thinking hadn't made impulsive decisions about anything, especially something as important as her legacy. I think Katherine's video testimony makes her mental state pretty clear, I replied. She explained her reasoning thoroughly and demonstrated complete cognitive competency. Unless you're suggesting that Dr. Henley participated in some elaborate conspiracy to defraud your family. Richard's pause was telling. He was clearly struggling to maintain his reasonable tone while processing the implications of what I'd said. Video testimony. Emma, what exactly did this attorney show you? Everything Katherine left for me to find. Her genealogical research, her DNA testing results, her documentation of your attempts to influence her estate planning, and her detailed explanation of why she chose me as her heir. Another pause. Longer this time. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost its artificial warmth. I see. So you believe you've uncovered some family conspiracy against you. Emma, I'm starting to worry that grief has affected your judgment more seriously than any of us realized. The shift in his tone was remarkable. Within minutes,
He'd moved from apologetic explanations to veiled threats about my mental stability. I realized this was probably his standard pattern when dealing with people who didn't respond to his initial manipulation. First charm, then intimidation, then attacks on their credibility or competence. My judgment is fine, Rich. Katherine left very clear instructions about how to handle exactly this situation. Katherine was a wonderful woman, but she was also 87 years old and dealing with significant health issues. Courts recognize that elderly people can become vulnerable to suggestion, especially when they're isolated from family members who might provide perspective on their decision. Richard was essentially arguing that Katherine's close relationship with me had been a form of elder abuse, that my love and attention had somehow compromised her ability to make rational decisions about her own estate. The accusation was both insulting and revealing. It showed that he genuinely couldn't conceive of a relationship between family members that wasn't based on financial calculation. Our conversation ended with Richard demanding that I provide him with copies of all the documents I'd found, claiming he had a right as Katherine's son to review any materials related to her estate. When I declined, he threatened to have his attorneys seek court orders compelling me to turn over what he called potentially fraudulent materials that might have been planted in Katherine's safe by unscrupulous lawyers. The threat was obviously empty. No court would order me to surrender documents that Katherine had specifically left for me to find. But it demonstrated how far Richard was willing to go to maintain his version of events. He was essentially arguing that any evidence contradicting his inheritance expectations must be fabricated, because the alternative would require acknowledging that his assumptions about Katherine's intentions had been completely wrong. That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything that had happened since Katherine's death. The pattern was clear. My relatives had spent months preparing for an inheritance that legally belonged to me, and they were now scrambling to protect investments of time and emotion they'd made based on false premises. Rather than accepting that their understanding of Katherine's intentions had been incorrect, they were choosing to attack the validity of her actual wishes and question my right to claim what she'd left me. But I also recognized that their desperation made them dangerous. People who stand to lose millions of dollars don't typically accept defeat gracefully, especially when they've convinced themselves that their expectations were legitimate. Richard and Caroline had resources, connections, and experience with legal systems that I lacked. They also had the advantage of public perception. Most people would assume that biological children deserve to inherit their parents' wealth, regardless of the parents' actual wishes or the legal realities involved. Katherine had anticipated these challenges and provided me with powerful tools to overcome them, but using those tools effectively would require careful strategy and strong legal representation. Dr. Henley was competent and experienced, but he specialized in estate planning rather than litigation. If my relatives decided to mount a serious challenge to Katherine's will, I would meet attorneys who specialized in inheritance disputes and family conflict. More importantly, I needed to prepare myself emotionally for a battle that would likely destroy any remaining relationships with my father's family. Richard and Caroline had already shown themselves willing to lie, manipulate, and threaten in order to protect their financial interests. As the stakes became higher and their legal position became more precarious, they would probably become even more aggressive in their attempts to discredit me and invalidate Katherine's final wishes. The next morning brought confirmation that the conflict was escalating beyond family arguments into legal warfare. Dr. Henley called to inform me that Richard's attorneys had already filed preliminary objections to probating Katherine's real will, claiming it was executed under suspicious circumstances that suggested fraud or undue influence. They were also seeking emergency court orders to prevent any changes to estate management until a full investigation could be completed. This is exactly what Katherine predicted would happen, Dr. Henley explained. She prepared for these challenges, but we need to respond quickly and decisively. They're trying to control the narrative by positioning themselves as victims of an elaborate deception rather than people who misunderstood their mother's intention. The legal battle was beginning, and I realized that winning it would require not just proving that Katherine's will was valid, but demonstrating that my relatives' version of events was a fabrication designed to protect their own interests. Katherine had given me the truth, but translating that truth into legal victory would demand everything I had learned from her about strength, strategy, and refusing to accept injustice. As I prepared to fight for my inheritance, I thought about Katherine's words in her final letter.
Justice is worth fighting for even when the battle seems impossible. She had known this moment would come, and she had spent her final years preparing me to face it with courage and determination. Now it was time to prove that her faith in my character and capabilities had been justified. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they should have as I climbed them on that crisp November morning, carrying the leather briefcase that had once belonged to my father Dave. Inside were copies of every document Katherine had left me, organized in the methodical way she'd taught me during those summer afternoons in her study. My attorney Sandra Kellerman walked beside me with the confident stride of someone who'd spent 20 years fighting inheritance disputes and winning most of them. Sandra was everything. Henley wasn't young, aggressive and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting her client's interests. She'd reviewed Katherine's documentation and called it the most thorough estate planning she'd ever encountered. Your grandmother wasn't just protecting your inheritance, she'd told me during our preparation meetings. She was building a fortress around it. Every potential attack has been anticipated and defended against. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and tall windows that let in the gray November light. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a distinguished man in an expensive suit who'd probably handled dozens of similar cases. Caroline sat behind them with Brittany and Madison, all dressed in conservative black as if they were still in mourning. They looked like the picture of a grieving family fighting to protect their mother's true intentions from an opportunistic outsider. Judge Patricia Morse entered precisely at 9 o'clock, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and penetrating eyes that reminded me of Katherine's gaze. She'd been on the bench for 15 years and had a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense to focus on facts and evidence. Sandra had specifically requested Judge Morse because of her track record in complex estate cases. Richard's attorney, Michael Preston, opened with exactly the argument Sandra had predicted. He painted a picture of an elderly woman whose judgment had been compromised by grief over her adopted son's death, making impulsive decisions influenced by a granddaughter who'd exploited her emotional vulnerability. He described me as a struggling social worker who'd manipulated Katherine's affections to secure an inheritance I'd never been promised and didn't deserve. Your Honor, Preston argued, Miss Whitmore's sudden decision to disinherit her biological children in favor of the daughter of her adopted son represents a dramatic departure from 40 years of consistent estate planning. The timing of this new will, executed just 2 months before her death, raises serious questions about her mental capacity and the circumstances under which these documents were created. Preston presented evidence of Katherine's recent health issues, including her hospitalization the previous Christmas, and her increasing dependence on pain medication for arthritis. He argued that these factors had made her susceptible to influence from someone who'd positioned herself as Katherine's primary caregiver and confidant. The portrait he painted was of a vulnerable elderly woman being taken advantage of by a calculating relative who'd isolated her from her real family. When Sandra rose to respond, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone holding a royal flush in a poker game. She began not with arguments but with facts, displaying Katherine's genealogical research on a large screen that showed the complete family tree dating back 4 generations. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. I carried genetic markers from William Whitmore's bloodline while Richard and Caroline carried none. Your Honor, this case isn't about an elderly woman making impulsive decisions, Sandra stated clearly. It's about a brilliant businesswoman who discovered that her legal heirs weren't her genetic heirs, and who made deliberate, well-documented choices about how to preserve her family's true legacy. Sandra played Katherine's video testimony, and hearing my grandmother's voice fill the courtroom brought tears to my eyes. Katherine spoke directly to every argument Preston had made, explaining her mental acuity, her careful research, and her reasoned conclusions about who should inherit the Whitmore estate. Her words were measured and precise, leaving no doubt about her competency or the deliberate nature of her decisions. I am not acting impulsively or under anyone's influence, Katherine said in the record. I am acting as the steward of a family legacy that deserves to be passed to someone who understands its responsibilities. Emma Morrison represents the continuation of values that my husband William and I spent our lives upholding. She has demonstrated through her choices and character that she will use our family's resources to benefit others rather than merely to enrich herself.
The video continued with Katherine addressing each potential objection to her will, including detailed explanations of why she'd chosen to exclude Richard and Caroline from significant inheritance. Her reasoning wasn't based on any animosity toward her children but on her observation that they viewed wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. She'd watched them prioritize material acquisition over service to others, and she'd concluded that leaving them substantial assets would reinforce values she didn't want associated with the Whitmore name. Sandra then presented the psychological evaluations Katherine had undergone, showing cognitive test scores that placed her in the 95th percentile for her age group. Elizabeth Hartman, the neuropsychologist who'd evaluated Katherine, testified that her patient had demonstrated exceptional mental clarity and sophisticated reasoning abilities right up until her death. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just competent to make complex estate planning decisions, Dr. Hartman explained. She was better equipped to analyze multiple variables and anticipate long-term consequences than most people half her age. Her decisions about her inheritance were consistent with the strategic thinking she'd displayed throughout her business career. The most damaging testimony for Richard and Caroline came from Maria Santos, Katherine's housekeeper of 12 years. Maria testified about conversations she'd overheard between Katherine and her children, including Richard's attempts to pressure his mother into revising her will and Caroline's suggestions that Katherine was becoming too attached to me. Miss Whitmore told me many times that her children saw her as a bank account rather than a person, Maria testified. She said Emma was the only family member who visited without asking for money or discussing inheritance. Mrs. Whitmore was very clear-minded about who loved her for herself and who loved her for what she could give them. Maria also testified about Katherine's meticulous planning in her final months, including the creation of the decoy will and the careful documentation of her genealogical discovery. Mrs. Whitmore spent hours in her study organizing papers and making copies of everything. She told me she was protecting Emma from people who would try to steal what belonged to her. Preston attempted to discredit Maria's testimony by suggesting she'd been influenced by promises of employment with me after Katherine's death, but Sandra quickly demolished that argument by showing that Katherine had already provided for Maria's future through a separate trust that was independent of the main inheritance dispute. The turning point came when Sandra called Dr. Henley to testify about his 40-year relationship with Katherine and his role in executing her estate plans. Dr. Henley explained that Katherine had been unusually thorough in her final planning, asking detailed questions about how to prevent inheritance challenges and what evidence would be needed to prove her mental competency. Ms. Whitmore specifically asked me about cases where wills had been overturned due to claims of undue influence. Dr. Henley testified. She wanted to ensure that her decisions couldn't be challenged on those grounds. That's why she insisted on the psychological evaluations, the video testimony, and the extensive documentation of her reasoning. Dr. Henley also revealed that Katherine had given him sealed instructions to be opened only if her will was challenged in court. Those instructions included detailed accounts of every conversation she'd had with Richard and Caroline about inheritance, including their attempts to influence her estate planning, and their dismissive comments about my deserving any significant inheritance. Miss Whitmore knew exactly what would happen after her death, Dr. Henley continued. She predicted that her children would attempt to invalidate any will that didn't meet their expectations, and she prepared accordingly. Everything we've seen in this courtroom, the claims of mental incompetency, the allegations of undue influence, the attempts to portray Emma as manipulative, Mrs. Whitmore anticipated all of it. Preston's cross-examination of Dr. Henley was devastating for his case. When he suggested that the attorney had participated in creating fraudulent documents, Dr. Henley produced contemporaneous notes from every meeting with Katherine, showing a clear timeline of her decision-making process and the evolution of her estate plan. The notes demonstrated that Katherine's final will was the result of months of careful consideration, not a sudden decision made under questionable circumstances. The most dramatic moment came when Sandra called Richard to testify about his knowledge of Katherine's estate plan. Under oath, Richard was forced to admit that he'd told Dr. Henley I was traveling abroad, preventing the attorney from following Katherine's instructions to contact me immediately after her death. When Sandra pressed him about where he'd gotten this information, Richard claimed he'd assumed I was out of town because I hadn't attended family gatherings in the days following Katherine's death. So you made this assumption without actually attempting to contact Emma or verify her whereabouts? Sandra asked. I thought it was reasonable to assume she needed time to grieve privately. And yet you proceeded with estate planning meetings during this same period when you supposedly believed the family should be focused on grieving. Richard's answer revealed the fundamental weakness in his position. He'd been simultaneously arguing that I was too grief-stricken to participate in estate proceedings while actively working to finalize those proceedings in a way that excluded me entirely. His testimony made it clear that his claim about my unavailability had been a convenient fiction designed to prevent me from learning about Katherine's real will. Caroline's testimony was even more damaging. When Sandra asked her about the text she'd sent regarding selling Katherine's belongings, Caroline initially claimed she'd been trying to expedite the estate settlement process, but under cross-examination, she was forced to admit that she'd planned to dispose of valuable items before any probate proceedings could be completed. You were planning to donate jewelry worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to charity, Sandra asked. I thought Emma might want some small keepsakes, but I didn't realize the full value of Katherine's collection. Mrs. Patterson, you've been familiar with your mother's jewelry collection for decades. Are you claiming you didn't know that her emerald necklace alone was appraised at over $50,000? Caroline's inability to provide a credible explanation for her rush to liquidate estate assets undermined her credibility and supported the argument that she and Richard had been acting in bad faith from the moment Katherine died. The final piece of evidence was Katherine's private investigator's report, which included recordings of conversations between Richard and Caroline discussing their strategy for influencing Katherine's estate plan. In one particularly damaging recording, Caroline could be heard saying, "We just need to help Mother understand that Emma's emotional attachment to the family doesn't qualify her to manage serious financial responsibility." Judge Morse listened to the entire recording without expression, but when it finished, she looked directly at Richard and Caroline with obvious disapproval. The recording demonstrated that they'd been actively working to exclude me from Katherine's inheritance long before she died, contradicting their claims that they'd only been concerned about proper estate management. After 3 days of testimony, Judge Morse retired to consider her decision. The wait was agonizing, but Sandra remained confident. Your grandmother built an airtight case, she told me during the recess. Every document supports your position, and every witness confirms Katherine's mental competency and clear intention. The other side has nothing but assumptions and wishful thinking. Judge Morse returned with a decision that was both comprehensive and unambiguous. She ruled that Katherine's final will was valid and enforceable, that there was no evidence of mental incompetency or undue influence, and that my relatives' attempts to prevent me from learning about the will constituted interference with estate administration. Whitmore was clearly a woman of exceptional intelligence and careful judgment. Judge Morse stated, her estate planning demonstrates the same strategic thinking and attention to detail that characterized her business career. The court finds no evidence that her decisions were impaired by age, illness, or outside influence. The judge went on to address Richard and Caroline's conduct during the estate proceedings. The evidence shows that the contestants deliberately misrepresented Miss Morrison's availability to prevent her from participating in estate administration. This behavior undermines their credibility and suggests they were aware that their inheritance expectations were not supported by their mother's actual intentions. Judge Morse awarded me the entire estate as Katherine had specified, along with attorney's fees and court costs. She also ordered Richard and Caroline to account for any estate assets they'd disposed of since Katherine's death, and to pay damages for any items that couldn't be recovered. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered her ruling. Richard sat with his head in his hands, while Caroline stared straight ahead with an expression of stunned disbelief. Brittany and Madison looked like they were attending a funeral, which, in a way, they were mourning the death of expectations they'd held for years about their financial future. Outside the courthouse, Richard attempted one final manipulation. He approached me as I walked toward Sandra's car, his voice taking on the pleading tone he'd used during our phone conversation. Emma, this doesn't have to destroy our family. We can still work something out privately. Katherine may have left you everything legally, but morally, you know she would have wanted her children to be provided for. I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about Katherine's words in her final letter. Justice is worth fighting for, even when the battle seems impossible. She'd known this moment would come, and she'd prepared me to face it with clarity rather than sentiment. Richard, Katherine did provide for her children. She raised you with every advantage money could buy. She supported your education, helped establish your career, and gave you 40 years of love and guidance. What she chose not to give you was an inheritance you'd use to perpetuate values she didn't want associated with the Whitmore name. You can't seriously believe that Katherine intended to leave her biological children with nothing. I believe Katherine intended to leave her legacy with someone who would honor it. That's exactly what she did. Richard's expression shifted from pleading to bitter acceptance. This isn't over, Emma. We'll appeal this decision, and we'll keep fighting until justice is done. Justice was done today, Richard. Katherine's wishes were honored, and her true heir received what she'd left them. You're welcome to appeal, but you'll be fighting the same evidence with the same result. As I walked away from the courthouse, I felt the weight of Katherine's legacy settling on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility I was finally ready to accept. She'd left me more than money and property. She'd left me the opportunity to continue her work of using wealth to benefit others, rather than merely to accumulate more wealth. 6 months later, I stood in the garden of what was now my house, watching the sunset through the same oak trees Katherine had planted 60 years earlier. The legal battles were over. Richard and Caroline had ultimately decided not to appeal Judge Morse's decision, when their attorney explained how unlikely they were to succeed with a higher court. The inheritance had transformed my life in ways both practical and profound. I'd left my job at the county to focus on managing Katherine's philanthropic legacy, expanding the scholarship fund she'd established, and creating new programs to help working families build financial stability. The house had become a meeting place for nonprofit organizations Katherine had supported, and I'd converted part of the property into affordable housing for families transitioning out of homelessness. But the most significant change was in my understanding of family and belonging. Katherine's revelation about my true genealogy had initially felt like another shock in a series of betrayals, but over time I'd come to see it as a gift. I wasn't the illegitimate outsider my relatives had made me feel like. I was the rightful heir to a legacy that stretched back 4 generations. My relationship with Richard and Caroline remained severed, probably permanently. They'd moved forward with their lives, presumably adjusting their expectations to match their new financial reality. Brittany and Madison had both blocked me on social media, which seemed like a small price to pay for freedom from their toxic dynamics. The most unexpected development had been my growing relationship with my mother, Lisa, who'd been stunned to learn about our family's hidden history. Katherine's genealogical research had revealed connections Lisa had never known about, including distant relatives she was now exploring relationships with. The discovery that her father had been a Whitmore descendant had reframed her entire understanding of her own identity. I always felt like there was something missing in our family story, Lisa told me during one of our weekly dinners at the house. Now I understand why. We were missing an entire branch of our heritage. As I prepared for bed that evening, I found myself thinking about Katherine's final letter, and her hopes for how I would use the inheritance. She'd wanted me to live a life free from financial stress, so I could focus on meaningful work rather than lucrative work. She'd wanted me to continue her tradition of quiet philanthropy, supporting causes that helped working families build better lives for their children. But more than anything, she'd wanted me to understand that real wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or property values. It was measured in the positive impact you had on other people's lives. The Whitmore fortune gave me the tools to make that impact, but the responsibility to use those tools wisely was mine alone. Standing at my bedroom window, looking out over the garden where Katherine had taught me to identify quality roses and spot authentic antiques, I made a promise to honor her memory by living up to her faith in my character. She'd chosen me as her heir not because of blood relationships or sentimental attachment, but because she'd believed I would use her legacy to make the world a little better for people who needed help. The real heir had indeed arrived, and I was finally ready to prove worthy of everything Katherine had entrusted to me. Her legacy would continue not through biological descendants who shared her DNA, but through values-based choices that reflected her commitment to using privilege responsibly and wealth generously. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that someone believed in your potential enough to trust you with their life's work. Katherine had given me that knowledge along with the means to honor it, and every day I had the opportunity to prove that her faith in me had been justified. The morning I decided to stop letting my relatives control the narrative was the morning everything changed. I woke up at 5:30, made coffee in the small kitchen of my studio apartment, and sat down at my laptop with a determination I hadn't felt since Katherine's death. For weeks, I'd been reacting to their moves, responding to their accusations, defending myself against their version of events. But Katherine hadn't raised me to be defensive. She'd taught me to be strategic. I opened a new document and began typing. Not a legal brief or a formal complaint, but a simple chronological account of everything that had happened since Katherine's death. The excluded will reading. The lies about my whereabouts, the rushed plans to liquidate estate assets, the accusations of fraud and manipulation. I wrote about the genealogical discoveries, the DNA evidence, and Katherine's careful documentation of her decision-making process. Most importantly, I wrote about the pattern of behavior that revealed my relatives' true priorities. The account wasn't emotional or accusatory. I simply presented facts with dates, times, and documentation. When I finished, it was 12 pages of clear, methodical evidence that told a story very different from the one Richard and Caroline had been promoting. They'd painted themselves as grieving children protecting their mother's true intentions from an opportunistic outsider. The facts showed them as calculating individuals who'd spent months planning to inherit wealth that legally belonged to someone else. By 7 o'clock, I was dressed and driving toward Lake Oswego, with a copy of my account and a portable scanner. If my relatives wanted to continue their rush to dispose of estate assets, they were going to have to do it with full documentation of their action. I had every legal right to enter Katherine's house and inventory its contents, and I intended to exercise that right before they could remove anything else. The house felt different as I walked through its familiar room. Without Katherine's presence, it seemed larger and emptier, but also somehow more peaceful. The tension that had characterized recent family gatherings was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity that reminded me of Katherine herself. I moved through each room systematically, photographing artwork, furniture, and personal items, while creating detailed inventory lists. In Katherine's study, I found evidence that my relatives had already been through her paper. File cabinets that had been meticulously organized were now in disarray, with folders removed and documents scattered. Several drawers had been forced open, suggesting they'd been searching for something specific. I suspected they'd been looking for additional wills or legal documents that might contradict their version of Katherine's intentions. But Katherine had been too smart to leave anything important where they could find it. The truly valuable documents had been secured in her private safe, accessible only to me. The papers they'd found and rearranged were mostly routine business correspondence and tax records that wouldn't help their case in any legal proceeding. I spent 3 hours documenting the current state of the house and its contents, taking thousands of photographs that would serve as evidence if my relatives claimed they hadn't removed or damaged anything. The process was emotionally difficult. Every room contained memories of Katherine and reminders of the relationship they were trying to minimize, but it was also empowering. I was no longer a passive victim of their manipulation. I was actively protecting my inheritance and honoring Katherine's wishes. Around 10 o'clock, I heard cars pulling into the driveway. Through the front windows, I could see Richard's BMW and Caroline's Mercedes, along with a large moving truck and several men in work clothes. They'd arrived to begin removing Katherine's belongings, apparently assuming I wouldn't be there to witness or document their actions. Richard entered the house first, stopping short when he saw me standing in the foyer with my camera and inventory list. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation, to something that looked almost like fear. He'd probably hoped to complete the liquidation process before I could interfere. "Emma, what are you doing here?" "Documenting my inheritance. Katherine left me this house and everything in it. which means I have every right to inventory its contents before anyone removes anything. Caroline appeared behind Richard, followed by Brittany and Madison. They were all dressed casually, clearly prepared for a day of manual labor. Caroline carried empty boxes and packing materials, while the girls had brought markers and labels for organizing items they planned to take. "This is ridiculous," Caroline said, her voice sharp with frustration. "We told you that you could have small keepsakes. We're not taking anything that belongs to you personally. Everything in this house belongs to me personally. Caroline, Katherine's will left me the entire estate, including all personal property and household items. That will is being contested," Richard interjected. "Until the legal issues are resolved, nobody should be removing anything from the house." I looked at him steadily. "Then why did you bring a moving truck?" The question hung in the air while Richard struggled to formulate an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. The moving truck outside made it clear that he'd planned to remove substantial amounts of property despite his claim that legal issues needed to be resolved first. His actions contradicted his words in a way that would be obvious to any objective observer. "We're just organizing things," Brittany said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. "Some of Grandma's belongings have sentimental value to the family. We're making sure those items are preserved properly." "Which item?" I asked, pulling out my phone to record the conversation. "I'd like to document which specific belongings you consider to have sentimental value." Madison grabbed Brittany's arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. Both girls looked uncomfortable with my systematic approach to documenting their actions. They'd probably expected emotional confrontation or tearful arguments, not methodical evidence gathering. Caroline stepped forward, adopting the patronizing tone she'd used with me since childhood. "Emma, honey, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. We're all family here. We can work together to honor Katherine's memory without turning everything into a legal battle. Katherine's memory is honored by respecting her final wishes. She left very clear instructions about how she wanted her estate handled." Katherine was elderly and possibly not thinking clearly toward the end. "You know she had some cognitive issues after her heart attack. Do you have medical documentation of cognitive issues? Because I have psychological evaluations that prove exactly the opposite." The conversation continued in this pattern for nearly an hour, with my relatives alternating between manipulation tactics and increasingly desperate justifications for their presence. They seemed genuinely shocked that I was standing my ground and refusing to accept their characterization of the situation. In their minds, I was still the quiet, accommodating granddaughter who'd always deferred to their authority. The turning point came when one of the workers from the moving company approached Richard to ask which items they should load first. Richard gestured toward Katherine's antique dining room set, a collection of 18th century pieces worth at least $50,000. The worker began wrapping the chairs in moving blankets while Richard directed him toward the china cabinet. "Stop," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody has authorization to remove anything from this house." The worker looked confused, glancing between Richard and me uncertain. Richard's face flushed with anger as he realized I wasn't going to allow him to proceed with his plans. "Emma, you're being completely unreasonable. These are family heirlooms that have been in our family for generations. They're family heirlooms that Katherine specifically left to me. If you want them, you can make an offer to purchase them after the estate is settled." Richard took a step toward me, his voice rising. "You have no right to hold our family's heritage hostage because you happen to manipulate an elderly woman into changing her will." The accusation was loud enough for the moving crew to hear, and I could see them exchanging glances as they realized they'd walked into a family dispute that might have legal implications. Smart workers don't want to be involved in potentially criminal activity, and unauthorized removal of estate property could definitely qualify. "Sir," one of the workers said to Richard, "do you have legal documentation authorizing removal of these items? We can't take property without proper paperwork." Richard couldn't produce any such documentation because none existed. His plan had depended on completing the removal before anyone could question his authority or demand legal proof of his right to dispose of estate assets. My presence had disrupted that plan and forced him to confront the reality that he had no legal standing to remove anything. The moving crew left within minutes, unwilling to risk liability for participating in authorized property removal. Richard tried to convince them to stay by promising payment for their time, but experienced movers understand the legal risks involved in disputed estate. They loaded their equipment and drove away, leaving my relatives standing in Katherine's driveway without any way to accomplish their objectives. Caroline attempted one final manipulation, appealing to emotions and family loyalty in the way she'd successfully done for decades. "Emma, I don't understand why you're being so hostile. We're grieving too. Katherine was our mother for over 50 years. Don't we deserve to have some remembrance of her? You deserve to have the remembrance Katherine chose to give you. She left you letters explaining her decisions and small personal gifts that she thought you'd value. She didn't leave you the right to take whatever you wanted from her estate. Those letters were cruel and hurtful. Katherine wasn't herself when she wrote them, or maybe she was more herself than she'd ever been able to be before." The conversation ended with my relatives leaving empty-handed and obviously frustrated. Richard made vague threats about legal action, while Caroline maintained her injured tone about family unity and respect for Katherine's memory. But their actions had revealed their true priorities more clearly than any words could have done. That afternoon, I called Dr. Lee to report the attempted removal of estate property. He was not surprised by their behavior but was pleased that I'd documented everything and prevented them from accomplishing their goals. "This incident actually strengthens your legal position," he explained. "Their attempt to remove valuable items before the estate is settled demonstrates consciousness of guilt. People who genuinely believe they have legitimate inheritance rights don't typically try to liquidate assets secretly." Dr. Henley also informed me that Richard's attorneys had filed preliminary motions challenging Katherine's will, exactly as we'd expected. The legal battle would be time-consuming and expensive, but Katherine's documentation was so thorough that the outcome was essentially predetermined. Courts rarely overturn wills when there's clear evidence of mental competency and detailed explanation of the testator's reasoning. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine that helped me maintain perspective during the legal proceeding. Every morning, I'd read portions of Katherine's letters to remind myself of her values and intentions. Every evening, I'd write in a journal about the day's events and my emotional responses to them. The writing helped me process the stress of the inheritance dispute while maintaining focus on the larger purpose Katherine had entrusted to me. The journal entries revealed patterns I hadn't recognized before. My relatives' behavior wasn't really about money or inheritance rights. It was about control and status. They'd spent years assuming they would inherit Katherine's wealth, and they'd made decisions based on those assumptions. My inheritance threatened not just their financial expectations, but their self-image as the important members of the family. Richard had built his identity around being Katherine's successful son, who would carry on the family business legacy. Caroline had defined herself as the daughter who understood sophistication and culture, worthy of inheriting Katherine's art collection and social connections. Brittany and Madison had grown up expecting to be wealthy heiresses who wouldn't need to worry about student loans or entry-level salary. My inheritance stripped away these identity constructs and forced them to confront the reality that Katherine hadn't seen them the way they saw themselves. She'd judged them by their character rather than their achievements, their values rather than their accomplishments. By that measure, they'd been found wanting, and the inheritance had gone to someone who better represented the principles Katherine wanted to perpetuate. Understanding their psychological motivations helped me approach the legal battle with compassion rather than anger. They weren't evil people trying to steal my inheritance. They were confused and hurt people trying to restore a worldview that had been shattered by Katherine's death. Their actions were still wrong and needed to be opposed, but I could oppose them without hatred or desire for revenge. The legal proceedings unfolded exactly as Dr. Henley had predicted. Richard's attorneys presented arguments about Katherine's mental state, my allegedly manipulative behavior, and the suspicious timing of her final will. Katherine's documentation systematically refuted each argument with evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis that left no reasonable doubt about her competency or the validity of her decision. The most powerful moment in the proceedings came when the court reviewed Katherine's video testimony. Watching her speak directly to the camera about her inheritance decisions, her voice clear and her reasoning logical, made it impossible to argue that she'd been mentally compromised or unduly influenced. She addressed every objection her children might raise and explained her responses with the same strategic thinking that had made her a successful businesswoman. When the court issued its final ruling in my favor, I felt not triumph but relief. The inheritance was legally mine, which meant I could finally begin the work Katherine had envisioned for me. The legal battle had been a necessary step in protecting her legacy, but it hadn't been the purpose of her planning. The purpose was what came next, using the Whitmore resources to benefit people who needed help building better lives for themselves and their families. 6 months after the court ruling, I stood in the garden of Katherine's house, my house watching the sunset through the oak trees she'd planted as a young bride. The legal battles were over, the inheritance was secure, and I'd begun implementing the philanthropic programs Katherine had dreamed about. The scholarship fund had been expanded to help 50 students per year instead of 10. The financial literacy program for women leaving abusive relationships had served over 200 participants in its first 6 months. But the most meaningful change was personal rather than programmatic. I'd found my place in the Whitmore family legacy, not as someone trying to prove her worthiness, but as someone carrying forward values that transcended blood relationships or legal documents. Katherine had chosen me, not because I was perfect, but because I understood that wealth was a responsibility rather than an entitlement. My relationship with Richard and Caroline never recovered, which seemed like a small price to pay for freedom from their toxic dynamic. They'd moved on with their lives, presumably adjusting their expectations to match their new financial reality. Occasionally, I heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Richard had taken a position with a hospital group in Seattle. Caroline had moved to her husband's family estate in Virginia, but we had no direct contact. The inheritance had given me resources I'd never expected to have, but more importantly, it had given me clarity about my values and purpose. Katherine's faith in my character had challenged me to live up to her expectations, to prove worthy of the trust she'd placed in me. Every day I had the opportunity to honor her memory by making choices that reflected her commitment to using privilege responsibly. Standing in the garden that evening, I thought about the woman who'd seen potential in a quiet granddaughter and nurtured it into something stronger than anyone had expected. Katherine had taught me that real strength wasn't about demanding what you deserved. It was about earning what you received and using it to benefit others. She'd shown me that family wasn't determined by biology or legal documents, but by shared values and mutual respect. The real heir had indeed arrived, and she was ready to prove that Katherine's faith had been justified. The Whitmore legacy would continue not through people who shared Katherine's DNA, but through choices that reflected her principles. And every morning when I woke up in the house where she'd taught me to value character over comfort, I had the chance to honor her memory by living the kind of life she'd believed I was capable of living. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that someone believed in your potential enough to trust you with their life's work. Katherine had given me that knowledge along with the means to honor it, and I intended to spend the rest of my life proving that her faith in me had been well placed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 year after Katherine's death, slipped under my apartment door like a secret message from the past. The handwriting on the cream-colored envelope was unfamiliar, but the return address made my breath catch. Morrison Genealogical Research, Denver, Colorado. Inside was a single page from Dr. Sarah Morrison, a genealogist who'd been contacted by someone claiming to be my cousin. The letter was brief but life-changing. Dear Miss Morrison, I've been researching our family tree for the past 5 years, and recently discovered information that connects our lineages in unexpected ways. Your great-grandfather Thomas Whitmore, who became Thomas Morrison after the war, had a sister named Margaret who survived the family tragedy in 19. Margaret had children, and I believe I am her great-granddaughter. If you're interested in learning more about family you never knew existed, please contact me. I read the letter 3 times before the implications fully registered. Not only was I not alone in carrying the Whitmore bloodline, but there were other descendants who'd been searching for their heritage just as Katherine had searched for her. The isolation I'd felt as the sole inheritor of the family legacy was suddenly replaced by the possibility of discovering relatives who might understand the weight of that inheritance. Sarah Morrison turned out to be a professor of history at the University of Colorado, who'd specialized in genealogical research after discovering gaps in her own family record. When I called her that afternoon, her voice carried the same measured intelligence I remembered from Katherine's phone conversations with business associates. She'd been researching the Morrison line for years, trying to understand why her family's oral history included references to wealth and property that had never materialized. My grandmother always insisted we had relatives in Oregon who owned significant land holdings, Sarah explained during our first conversation. She talked about a brother who'd changed his name and moved west after the war, but we could never find any documentation. When I started professional genealogical research, I discovered Thomas Morrison's original identity as Thomas Whitmore and began tracing his family connection. Sarah had found Katherine's obituary during her research and been struck by the description of a woman who'd built a real estate empire and left substantial charitable bequests. The timeline matched her grandmother's stories about successful Western relatives, and further investigation had revealed the DNA connections that proved our relationship. I've been hesitant to contact you because I know inheritance disputes can be complicated. Sarah continued. I'm not seeking any claim to Katherine Whitmore's estate. I'm simply interested in learning about family history and possibly meeting relatives I never knew existed. Her approach was so different from Richard and Caroline's financial focus that it immediately put me at ease. Sarah was driven by curiosity about her heritage rather than expectations about inheritance. She wanted to understand her family's past, not claim ownership of its present. We arranged to meet the following weekend in Portland, and I spent the intervening days wondering what it would be like to have family members who shared Katherine's values rather than challenging them. Sarah had built her career around uncovering truth and documenting history, professions that required the same careful attention to evidence that Katherine had valued in her business dealing. Sarah arrived at the house on Saturday morning carrying a leather satchel filled with documents, photographs, and research materials. She was a woman in her early 40s with Katherine's green eyes and the same way of listening intently when others spoke. Her presence in Katherine's living room felt natural in a way that my other relatives' visits never had. The documents she'd brought told a story that filled in gaps Katherine's research had never been able to bridge. Margaret Whitmore had indeed survived the family tragedy in 1943, but she'd been severely injured and spent months in a hospital recovering from burns. When she was released, she'd been told that her brothers Thomas and William were dead, killed in the same fire that had destroyed their family home. Margaret had been placed with distant relatives who'd eventually adopted her and changed her surname to Philip. She'd grown up believing she was the sole survivor of her immediate family, never knowing that Thomas had also survived and started a new life under an assumed name. The brothers had spent their entire lives believing each other was dead, each carrying grief for family they thought they'd lost. Margaret married young and had 3 children, Sarah explained, showing me photographs of a woman who looked remarkably like Katherine around the eyes and mouth. She always felt like something was missing from her life, but she never knew. She used to tell my father that she dreamed about brothers she couldn't quite remember, voices calling her name from rooms she'd never seen. The photographs Sarah brought were revelations in themselves. Margaret as a young woman bore a striking resemblance to Katherine, with the same determined expression and elegant posture. Pictures of Margaret's children showed family features I recognized from my own reflection. The distinctive Whitmore chin, the way we all tilted our heads when listening carefully, the smile that started in our eyes before reaching our mouth. But the most amazing discovery was in Margaret's personal effects, which Sarah had inherited when her grandmother died. Hidden in an old jewelry box was a locket containing a photograph of 3 children, Margaret herself and 2 boys who could only be Thomas and William Whitmore. On the back in a child's careful handwriting were the words Margaret, Tommy and Willie, forever family 19. She'd kept their picture hidden away like a secret treasure, probably not even understanding why it was important to her. The locket had been passed down through her family as a mysterious heirloom that no one could explain. When I found this photograph and compared it to pictures of William Whitmore that I'd discovered in historical records, the resemblance was unmistakable, Sarah said. That's when I knew for certain that we were related to the Oregon Whitmore. As we spent the day comparing family histories and genealogical research, I began to understand the full scope of what Katherine had discovered in her final year. She hadn't just found evidence that I carried Whitmore blood. She'd uncovered the beginning of a family network that had been scattered by tragedy and circumstance, but never completely destroyed. Sarah had brought contact information for 2 other potential relatives, her cousin Michael Phillips in Colorado, who was Margaret's grandson, and shared our DNA markers, and a woman named Jennifer Chin, in California, whose grandmother had been adopted by a family that might have connections to the scattered Whitmore siblings. I've been cautious about reaching out to them because I wanted to verify our connection first, Sarah explained. But if you're interested in meeting more family, we could arrange a larger gathering to share what we've all discovered. The idea of having family members who understood the importance of heritage and history rather than viewing it solely as a financial opportunity was almost overwhelming. These were people who'd spent years researching their backgrounds, not because they expected to inherit wealth, but because they valued understanding their place in a larger family story. Over the following months, I stayed in regular contact with Sarah while we carefully reached out to other potential relatives. Michael Phillips turned out to be a high school history teacher in Denver who'd inherited Margaret's curiosity about family origins along with her photograph collection. Jennifer Chin was a documentary filmmaker whose adoption research had revealed connections to families displaced by wartime upheavals. The 4 of us met for the first time in Katherine's house during the spring following her death. It was an extraordinary experience to sit around the dining room table where I'd eaten countless meals with Katherine, sharing stories and documents with people who understood the significance of what we'd inherited. Michael had brought a trunk of Margaret's belongings that included letters she'd written but never sent, addressed to my brothers wherever you are. The letters revealed that Margaret had spent her entire adult life wondering if Thomas and William had survived, hoping they were building families and finding happiness somewhere beyond her reach. Jennifer's contribution was a collection of oral histories she'd recorded with elderly relatives, including stories about a great-uncle who'd supposedly made a fortune in Oregon real estate. The timeline and details matched William Whitmore's biography so closely that there was no doubt about the family connections. As we sat together in Katherine's living room, surrounded by her books and antiques, I felt a profound sense of completion. Katherine had searched for family connections in her final years, hoping to understand the full scope of the Whitmore legacy. She'd found evidence of my bloodline but hadn't lived long enough to discover the other branches of the family tree that had survived and flourished. Katherine would have loved meeting all of you, I told them as we shared dinner that evening. She always believed that family was about more than blood relationships, but she also valued understanding the connections that link us across generations. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. From everything you've told us about her, it sounds like she embodied the same values that Margaret always talked about, taking care of people who needed help, using whatever advantages you had to benefit others, never forgetting where you came from. The conversation that followed revealed that each branch of the scattered Whitmore family had maintained similar values despite growing up in different states and circumstances. Michael had dedicated his teaching career to working with at-risk students in underserved communities. Jennifer used her filmmaking skills to document stories of immigrant families and displaced populations. Sarah had built her academic career around helping people understand their cultural heritage. None of us had known about the others, but we'd all been shaped by principles that seemed to flow from our shared ancestry. The Whitmore commitment to service and responsibility had somehow been transmitted across generations and geographical distances, creating a family culture that transcended immediate relationships. I think this is what Katherine meant when she talked about family legacy, I realized during our conversation. It's not just about inheriting money or property. It's about carrying forward values that make the world better for future generations. Over the summer, we developed a plan for honoring both Katherine's memory and the larger Whitmore family history. Using resources from the estate, we established a genealogical research foundation that would help other families reconnect with relatives separated by war, displacement, or adoption. We also created a scholarship program specifically for students who were the first in their families to pursue higher education, recognizing the importance of expanding educational opportunities. The Foundation's first project was documenting the complete Whitmore family history, including the stories of family members who'd been lost to historical records. Sarah took the lead on this research, using her academic credentials and professional expertise to create a comprehensive archive that would be preserved for future generations. Michael contributed his teaching experience to develop educational materials about family history research, creating resources that could be used in schools and community centers. Jennifer applied her documentary skills to record video interviews with elderly relatives, preserving their stories before those memories were lost forever. My role was providing the financial resources and administrative support that allowed the others to focus on their areas of expertise. Katherine's inheritance gave me the ability to fund projects that would have been impossible for any of us to pursue individually. But the most meaningful aspect of our collaboration was personal rather than professional. For the first time since Katherine's death, I had family members who understood the responsibility that came with our shared heritage. They appreciated the weight of the Whitmore legacy without expecting to profit from it personally. As autumn arrived and we prepared for the first anniversary of Katherine's death, I found myself reflecting on the year that had transformed my understanding of family inheritance and belonging. The legal battle with Richard and Caroline seemed like ancient history, a necessary but temporary conflict that had protected Katherine's wishes, but hadn't defined the ultimate meaning of her legacy. The real meaning was in the work we were doing together, honoring the past while building something beneficial for the future. Katherine had left me her material wealth, but she'd also left me the opportunity to discover family I'd never known existed, and to create new traditions that reflected our shared values. Standing in Katherine's garden on the anniversary of her death, surrounded by relatives who'd traveled from across the country to honor her memory, I understood that she'd given me more than money or property. She'd given me the foundation for building the kind of family she'd always believed the Whitmores could be. People united not just by blood or legal documents, but by commitment to using whatever advantages they possessed to help others build better lives. The real heir hadn't just arrived. She'd found her real family and discovered her real purpose. Katherine's legacy would continue not through people who shared her last name, but through choices that honored her values and expanded her vision of what family wealth could accomplish. Sarah raised a glass of Katherine's favorite wine as we gathered around the oak tree she'd planted as a young bride. To Katherine Whitmore, she said, who showed us that family is about more than the past we inherit. It's about the future we choose to create. As the sun set through the branches of that ancient tree, I knew that Katherine was finally at peace. She'd found a way to reunite family members who'd been separated by tragedy and time, and she'd ensured that the Whitmore name would be associated with service and generosity for generations to come. The inheritance dispute that had seemed so important a year ago now felt like just the first step in a much larger journey. Katherine hadn't just left me wealthy, she'd left me the opportunity to discover who I really was and what I was capable of becoming. And surrounded by family who understood both the privilege and responsibility of our shared heritage, I was finally ready to prove worthy of everything she'd entrusted to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.